The morning of May 19, 1536, broke over the Tower of London with an ominous hush. Mists hung like gauze over the battlements, the air thick with dew and dread. The River Thames flowed quiet beneath the grey skies, its reflection marred only by the soft ripple from the occasional oar. A chamber deep within the tower stirred gently its occupant. Queen Anne Boleyn had been awake since well before the sun began to rise. Inside her small, stark lodgings in the Queen's house, Anne sat dressed already, a dark gown of English damask clinging modestly to her slender form. She had chosen it deliberately, neither garish nor meek, but dignified. Her long dark hair was unbound, a satin veil falling softly down her back. Her hands, pale and motionless in her lap, held a tiny prayer book. Occasionally, she turned a page without looking at it. Her eyes did not stray far from the barred window, though it offered nothing but grey light and stone. Sir William Kingston stood dutifully outside her chamber door. Though he was a man known for following orders with precision, his lips were drawn more tightly this morning, and his stance stiffened with discomfort. He had come to regard the Queen with quiet admiration during her confinement. Her fortitude confounded him. This was no shattered woman awaiting judgment. This was a figure of unbowed grace. Within the room, Anne at last rose to her feet. "Is it time?" she asked, her voice level, the tremor in it, well tamed by years of courtly composure. Kingston bowed solemnly and gave a slight nod. "The hour approaches, Your Grace. The executioner has arrived." She closed her prayer book, caressing the leather cover before tucking it gently beneath her arm. There was a pause long enough for her to let the words settle in her mind. Then, slowly, and with almost surreal calm, she approached the mirror. In the soft reflection, she smoothed her veil and adjusted the neckline of her gown. Her eyes locked with her own image, not searching for vanity, but for resolve. "There is nothing to fear from death," she murmured, repeating lines she'd whispered aloud to herself in the early hours. "God has been kind to me." In the doorway, Kingston waited, but he did not rush her. A small group of women faithful attendants, their faces wet with silent tears, gathered behind her. One stepped forward to offer a kerchief. Anne accepted it with gratitude, though she had not yet wept. Instead, she turned to them all and said, "Do not despair. We are nearer grace now than we have ever been." As she walked through the halls toward the green scaffold, the tower's cobblestones echoed faintly under her step. Every eye turned to her guards, attendants, officials with mixtures of reverence and horror. Even the birds in the trees above seemed to fall silent. And then she emerged into the morning light, where death and history waited. The scaffold stood ready, draped in black. The French executioner, cloaked and still, bowed low at her approach. She returned not a glance to him. Her gaze instead scanned the crowd, briefly settling on Kingston, then beyond him, as though to something no other could see. She ascended the steps with the bearing of a queen. The great halls of the Tudor court shimmered with light torchlight flickering off polished gold and jewelled gowns. Music, threading through chambers heavy with secrets and ambition. When Anne Boleyn returned to England after years spent in the cultured courts of Europe, she did not expect to transform the heart of a nation. Yet from the moment she stepped into the orbit of King Henry VIII, the course of English history began its sweeping turn. Anne was not born royal, but she moved with the grace of one who knew greatness was not always a gift of birth. Trained among the most fashionable circles of the Netherlands and France, she had acquired a polish and sophistication rare among English noblewomen. Fluent in French, deeply read, and steeled by exposure to political courts, far more refined than Henry's England, Anne captivated with a blend of mystery and intellect. Her laughter could enchant, but her eyes always calculated. When her sister Mary's brief affair with the king faded like so many before, it was Anne who caught and held Henry's restless gaze. At first, Anne resisted. She allowed Henry's attentions, but did not surrender to them. Letters passed between them, thick with longing and frustration. Henry, now a man obsessed, found in Anne not just a desirable woman, but an idea. She was boldly, dangerously not willing to become another mistress. If he wanted her, he would have to make her queen. Thus began a courtship fused with political upheaval. Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon once unshakable, became a burden. With Anne's encouragement, he began seeking an annulment despite the Pope's refusal. The more resistance the Church offered, the more Henry retreated inward until he severed ties with Rome entirely. Religious doctrine and royal tradition unravelled for a woman whose allure was matched only by her belief that she could wield influence as few women had. In 1533, Anne's rise was sealed. She married Henry in a quiet ceremony, and with swelling pride and new life in her womb, she was crowned Queen of England. The coronation was unlike any other, staged in Westminster Abbey with Tudor splendour, yet overshadowed by controversy. Many nobles refused to acknowledge her claim, murmuring objections behind silken fans. Still, Anne was radiant. Precise in her gestures, regal in her bearing, she strode the crimson carpet, not meekly, but as a woman who earned not inherited her position. Her coronation was designed not just to legitimize, but to symbolize a break from the old order. Unlike queens before, Anne was not of royal blood, nor a passive consort. Her influence extended beyond silk gowns and nursery chambers. She advocated for religious reform, championing Protestant scholars, and securing the positions of men like Thomas Crann. She wasn't merely a symbol, she was a power in motion. Yet in reshaping the monarchy, she sparked resentment. Her undeniable intelligence and sharp tongue bruised fragile egos at court. Allies of Catherine of Aragon, conservatives entrenched in Catholic tradition, and even Henry's own advisers, namely Thomas Cromwell, began to question whether Anne had become too much. Still, in those first heady months beneath the crown, Anne believed in her purpose. She believed she was chosen by Providence and by the King himself to usher England into a new, reformed future. In every calculated smile, every carefully spoken word, Anne Boleyn wore not just jewels and silks, but the weight of revolution. In the austere marble halls of Whitehall, behind tapestry-lined corridors and candlelit antechambers, the Queen had become a figure, not merely of admiration, but of whispered defiance. Anne Boleyn, spirited and sharp-tongued, challenged the court's conventions simply by standing tall in rooms that had long belonged only to kings and silent queens. She was not silent. She was vivid, reformist, alive with ambition that made her dangerous. Anne's enemies did not announce themselves. They curtsied low, smiled narrowly, and stepped aside with eyes fixed upon her crown. But behind closed doors, power conspired against her. Few wielded that power more shrewdly than Thomas Cromwell. The king's chief minister had once been her ally in reformation, but power makes strange bedfellows and stranger enemies. As Anne pushed for further reforms, redirecting money from the monasteries into charitable causes, she promoted Cromwell saw a queen prepared to meddle with his own wealth-accumulating schemes. Their brief alignment was undone by conflicting ambitions and sharpened shadows. They did not clash in public, but Cromwell's silence grew louder around her. In whispered counsel with conservative barons, he began crafting a plan that would see her removed, not exiled, but erased. Others harboured quieter resentments. Jane Seymour, the pale-faced lady-in-waiting with downturned eyes, played her role with perfect subservience. She offered the king patience where Anne had fire, a promise of docile partnership in contrast to the Queen's influence. To Henry, weary of Anne's stubbornness and still without a male heir, Jane became the echo of a simpler time of submissiveness, passed off as virtue. She said little, but each word carried the weight of longing, fulfilled by vacancy. The court muttered. The clergy balked. Anne's failure to produce a sombre perceived proof required to validate her place became a spectre at her side at every banquet, sermon and masque. Prince Henry had died as an infant, leaving only Elizabeth, a girl of luminous curiosity but no value in patriarchal eyes. The same sycophants who once declared Anne's coronation a divine event now recalled the dignity of Queen Catherine and the sins of the break with Rome. Anne fought on, never with despair but with fervour. Her chapels retained hints of Protestant leanings, and she continued to sponsor scholars and reformers. Her convictions had not diminished, they had matured. But in the flickering candlelight of power, conviction could look like arrogance, especially when delivered from the lips of a woman. The courtiers who had once marvelled at her resolute gaze now avoided her presence. Some mocked her behind fans. Others placed strategic silences between conversations. Even her brother, George Boleyn, gifted and increasingly wary-counselled caution. "You are too bold," he murmured as they strolled beneath sycamore trees. "Power here rewards silence." Anne had smiled at him, not in defiance, but in understanding. "Then it was never mine to keep," she replied. Her enemies were not always louder than her allies, but they were more united. They moved with quiet coordination, fangs beneath velvet favour, and behind them all, the king's affection of fire once consuming had become ash, cold and scattered, waiting for Cromwell's storm to arrive. Greenwich Palace stood in glittering spring sunlight, but behind its gilded windows, an ominous chill clutched the hearts of many. The once admired Queen Anne no longer held the king's gaze, nor the court's favour. What was once whispered had grown bold. Jane Seymour wore modest eyes and careful smiles, and it was to her Henry now turned with barely concealed longing. Anne Boleyn fierce. Reformist Anne had become an inconvenient reminder of a breaking promise. Anne, however, remained publicly composed. At court, her movements were precise, her words measured, and her gaze steady, though her brow bore the silent tension that only a woman sensing her own eclipse might wear. George noticed first. "You are being watched more than welcomed," he said quietly in the garden one morning, his voice almost lost to the breeze. She only nodded. Then came the blow. On May 20, Anne was summoned while playing at cards, her laughter still hanging in the air when the king's men arrived. Dressed in pale silk, unbecoming now for the drama to follow, she was removed from Greenwich, with no time to bid farewell to her daughter or plead her case to the king. The charges trickled out like poisoned honey. Adultery, incest, treason. The shock was immediate. Escorted by barge to the Tower of London, Anne passed beneath Traitor's Gate, the Queen, who once entered by coronation arches, now reduced to criminal entrance. Sir William Kingston received her with the gravity of a seasoned custodian, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of pity as Anne stepped into her chamber. "Am I truly a prisoner?" she asked softly, standing where so many had fallen before. When Kingston merely bowed, she smiled faintly. "No need to answer. The walls speak." Within those walls, Anne grappled with injustice, cloaked in royal command. She oscillated between quiet prayer and moments of sharp-witted clarity. Confined but never conquered, she stated to Kingston, "I do not fear death, but I would have wished for more honesty in its arrival." His reports sent daily to Cromwell documented her steadiness, her composure, her occasional tears. Tears not of guilt, but disbelief. Outside the tower, Thomas Cromwell, calculated and implacable, tied knots others had only whispered of. Courtiers were summoned like cast members in a macabre play. Mark Smeaton, the musician made to confess under cruel duress. Sir Henry Norris, once a confidant of the king. Weston and Brereton, young men with little defence beyond unfortunate proximity. And George Boleyn, her beloved brother, named alongside Anne in the cruelest of accusations. The charges, concocted with surgical accuracy, turned court gossip into execution warrants. Every supposed indiscretion detailed in the documents was timed with deliberate framing. Ironically, the passionate woman who had once undone a queen now had her own downfall diagrammed with cold efficiency. As Henry lingered with Jane Seymour whispering affection and wedding plans, Anne remained behind stone walls, awaiting a trial whose ending had already been written. The silence from the king was louder than any verdict. By mid-May, England no longer spoke of Queen Anne in the present tense. The downfall was not gradual. It was swift, calculated, and absolute, like a sudden gust of wind extinguishing a flame. And yet, in Anne's eyes, the fire never fully died. The tower's stone walls bore witness to whispered treason and crowned betrayal, but never had they enclosed a spectacle so fraught with paranoia as Anne Boleyn's trial. On May 15, 1536, the Queen was led from her quarters at the royal apartments to the great hall within the tower ground sconce. A fortress of protection, now a vessel of condemnation. She moved with a defiant grace, every step echoing off the flagstones like a drumbeat toward oblivion. Her gown, of sombre grey damask trimmed with black, whispered as she passed, a queen still in bearing, if not in favour. The hall was heavy with tension. Nobles filled the oak benches, their eyes sharpened by curiosity and calculation. Yet despite the grandeur of the setting, the banners fluttering above the dais, the polished oak of the judgment seat this was no court of truth. The very peers who sat in judgment were selected by order of the king, their loyalty measured not in virtue, but in obedience. Presiding at the head was the Duke of Norfolk, Anne's own uncle, his face carved in stone. Thomas Cromwell sat in the shadows, not on trial, but commanding it. His gaze never wavered, scanning Anne for weakness. Here was the woman who had undone a queen, and reformed a church now caged by the instruments of the same power she'd dared to mould. The charges read aloud struck like hammer blows. Adultery, incest, conspiracy to kill the king. The hall stirred with murmurs, though many had heard these accusations whispered in the court's darker corners. Anne sat erect, folding her hands in her lap, betraying not a flicker though her eyes were dark wells of disbelief. Within reach she could see George her brother, her trusted ally. His face remained composed but pale, jaw locked against fury. When called upon, Anne rose, her voice, clear and measured, knifed through the silence. "I do not say I am faultless," she began, "but never have I betrayed my queenly oath." Her words did not plead, but parted the air like a sword. "I have been a faithful wife, though found barren by God's will, not my own. And to accuse me of crime with my brother—" She paused, the audience absorbed in the raw humanity of her restraint. "Is not only monstrous, but cruelly absurd." Gasps circled the room, and for a moment even Norfolk looked away. The testimony against her was riddled with wholesale-edge meetings that defied time and distance, accounts offered under duress or promise of favour. But truth had no place here. The outcome had been etched long before the trial began. Archbishop Cranmer, once a steadfast supporter, now sat with head bowed, lips barely moving in silent confession of regret. Across the chamber, Jane Seymour's absence was louder than any presencer name hovering unspoken, a ghostly future already occupying the Queen's throne. After hours of deliberation or pretense thereof, the verdict arrived: guilty. The sentence: death by fire or sword at the King's discretion. Anne did not weep. She inclined her head with icy composure. "I am the King's true wife," she murmured, more to herself than the court, "and God knows the secrets of every heart." As she was led away, the shadows within the hall lengthened, as if mourning her verdict. England had witnessed a trial, but justice had not been in attendance. Dawn broke over the Tower of London with a hush that felt sacred. Mist clung low to the cobblestones, and the first crow's echo rang like a knell across the courtyard. Within the ancient fortress walls, Anne Boleyn stood in prayer, wrapped not in regal finery, but in a heavy grey cloak. Her face was pale but composed, her dark eyes fixed not on this world, but some distant, divine mercy. Sir William Kingston stood nearby, his hat pressed to his chest, gaze lowered. He had escorted queens before, but never to death, not like this. His every movement was precise, born of respect she had earned, not by title, but by her dignity in captivity. Anne met his eyes with the shade of a smile. "I am ready, Sir Kingston," she said calmly. "Please do not keep him waiting." Her ladies wept silently in the corridor as Anne passed. She did not falter. Each step to the scaffold was graceful, not a queen's procession, yet somehow more powerful. As she emerged into the open air, the assembled crowd hushed, their breath forming little clouds against the chill. Even the birds seemed to fall silent. A black-clad figure stood at the scaffold's edge, the executioner of Calais. Thin and still, he carried his gleaming sword, not raised, but cradled, like something sacred. He watched her approach not with cruelty, but an odd reverence, befitting the task he had travelled in secrecy to perform. The scaffold itself was modest, flanked by guards in muted armour, faces unreadable. Anne ascended with a lightness that belied her fate. Her gown, a sombre shade of damask grey, blended with the overcast sky, the French hood upon her head, catching the dawn like a crown. "I am come hither to die," Anne said in a clear voice, addressing the small crowd. "I die a good Christian woman, and I do not accuse any man of my death. God knows all, and I leave judgment to him." Her words did not quake, not once. Her calm unsettled those watching more than sorrow ever could. Among them, Thomas Cromwell stood beneath a shadowed archway, unreadable. Across the courtyard, Jane Seymour remained indoors, veiled and absent, a ghost of the future queen already forming. Anne turned to Sir Kingston and gently removed her hood, baring her neck. She knelt without aid, her hands folded, lips moving in silent prayer. The wind shifted, and her dark hair moved softly against her cheek. The executioner stepped forward and laid the sword upon the platform beside her. He addressed his assistant softly. "Bring me the sword," though it already rested at his feet, a ruse to steady Anne's awareness. As she prayed, still and serene, he stepped behind her with silent, cat-like grace. In a breath bound by centuries, his arms raised and the blade flashed. One stroke clean, precise. The queen fell in silence. The crowd did not cheer, nor cry. Just stunned stillness, broken only by the quiet flap of distant banners. The executioner bowed once, quickly, then vanished into the mist from whence he came. And with that, Anne Boleyn, queen, reformer, mother of a future monarch, met her end with incomparable elegance. Hers was not a fall, but an ascension cloaked in grief. The tower's walls bore silent witness to the execution, but long after Anne's body was carried away, her presence lingered. The air in London felt heavier in the days that followed unnaturally still, as though the city collectively drew breath and could not release it. Whispers filled the court, not just with pity or fear, but with unease. They had not only beheaded a queen, but struck at the heart of a hope many didn't realise they'd had. For Henry, the transition was both swift and callous. Within 11 days, he wed Jane Seymour with quiet ceremony, as if to erase the noise of the scaffold with a new symbol of hope for his dynasty. The court adapted with chilling speed, swearing loyalty to Jane and rewriting their memories of Anne with remarkable convenience. Tapestries bearing her falcon crest were removed or altered. Servants who had once bowed to Queen Anne now averted their eyes when her name was mentioned. But Anne was not so easily forgotten. Long after her head fell, England still reeled from her life. Among the common people, reactions were complex. Many had doubted Anne, viewing her rise with suspicion and scandal. But after her death, even critics questioned the justice of it. A queen killed on charges, too lurid and unproven to be true, was that what England had become? Ballads crept through taverns, sung in quiet corners so as not to catch the ears of informants. Ballads not celebrating Anne's downfall, but lamenting her fate, and wondering, grimly, what justice meant in a realm where a king's love could vanish like mist and take lives with it. In hidden chapels, and among certain reformist clergymen, Anne's name became a soft refrain in prayers, not as a martyr declared by Rome, but as a symbol of religious hope dashed by politics. Archbishop Cranmer knelt quieter in prayer now, his hands trembling. Though he had signed the annulment out of obedience, he would never shake the image of Anne in the Tower Chapel the night before her death, speaking with a clarity and devotion he could scarcely match. "I die," she had said, "the king's good servant, but God's first." The irony haunted him. George Boleyn's name, too, was not forgotten. Some of his verses were smuggled into printed leaflets, the poetry of a noble scapegoat acquiring new power. The siblings' courage became a bitter legend. Yet Anne's greatest legacy came not in ghost stories, nor whispered ballads, but through her daughter. Elizabeth Tudor, fiery and brilliant, carried the fire her mother had lit. Though declared a bastard after Anne's death, she was not forgotten. A girl raised under a cloud became, years later, the Virgin Queen England's most enduring monarch. Those who lived long enough to see Elizabeth crowned said the ghost of Anne must have watched from heaven, vindicated. And so Anne lingered not just through bricks of the Tower, where some claimed her spirit walked under moonlight, but in lasting reform and royal blood. Her greatest triumph came decades later, through a daughter who bore her spirit, unmatched wit, and unbroken will. Anne Boleyn died a queen, disgraced, but rose in history as a queen transformed, no longer a woman undone by ambition, but a catalyst for change England could never undo. The morning mist clung to the stoic stones of the Tower, shrouding its battlements like a mourner's veil. Within those sombre walls, Anne Boleyn sat in quiet meditation. Even clothed plainly in grey and white, her presence seemed to resist the crumbling dignity imposed on her. Once a queeno, more than that a catalyst, she was now resigned to die not merely by a nation's hand, but as a symbol of what England had become, and what it might yet be. She had worn the English crown like no consort before her, not as an ornament on the king's arm, but as a sovereign force reshaping the realm's soul. Her coronation in 1533 had been filled with more than pomp. It had carried the weight of revolution. She had not been a foreign princess, nor a noble's daughter bred only for marriage. No, Anne had risen by merit, cleverness, and conviction. And in doing so, she had invited both adoration and enmity in equal measure. At court, she was unyielding. Where others flattered, she questioned. Where courtiers simpered, she challenged. With French flair and Protestant fire, she stood at Henry's side, no behind. And that, more than all, unnerved those who had prospered under older rules. Men like Cromwell saw in Anne not just a queen, but a disruption. To politics, to faith, to power itself. She'd harboured no illusions. Reform bred turmoil. Yet Anne believed in it still. She'd championed Tyndale's banned scriptures, whispered prayers in English while her ladies looked warily over their shoulders. Even in the nursery, she had interrupted centuries. Her daughter, Elizabeth, though a girl, was raised not for silence but for statecraft. A lion's cub, Anne had once remarked a jest-turned prophecy. But what most branded her a heretic among the old guard, and a threat to Henry himself, was not faith, or gender, or wit, it was independence. When Anne lost her son and failed to carry another male heir, whispers became proclamations. She could not fulfill the king's desire. And so her enemies clustered like birds over battlefields. Jane Seymour waited in the wings, her silence a blade sharper than words. As accusations slivered through council chambers, adultery, incest, treason, Anne stood motionless. Her trial was theatre, grand in setting but hollow in justice. The peers who had once toasted her sipped guilt and cowardice in private. Rochester, her own brother, was condemned with her family weaponized as spectacle. She bore it all with eyes wide open. In the end, stripped of crown, denounced by king and nation, Anne knelt not in surrender, but in defiance. She prayed in English, the same language of the gospel she'd once smuggled into courtrooms and corners. And when she thanked God for her good and gracious king, her voice betrayed no sarcasm, only resolve a dying queen reciting a living scripture. The sword fell swiftly, but its echo did not. In Anne's death, England buried more than a woman it savaged, a future it feared and did not yet understand. Yet that future came all the same. It would walk again with Anne's daughter, dressed not in mourning but in majesty. And every brick of the Reformation to come would carry the memory of a queen who, unafraid, wore a crown of thorns.